All right, so we're on chapter 7 now. The first part, 7.1, is there's not a whole lot of new stuff in there because by now you should feel pretty comfortable with your factoring skills. And that's all you're going to do. You have fractions and where you're going to have to factor your numerators and denominators. And then remember, if you have the same thing on both the top and bottom part of your fractions, well, those things would cancel out. So you're just really simplifying, you're factoring and then simplifying these fractions. First kind of fraction you're going to see, you may get a couple of problems like this, and they look very similar, but they're not exactly the same. So normally you do have that variable first. So if we rewrote this bottom part of the denominator, and I'm going to switch the x and the 4 around. So it would look like this, negative x plus 4. Or on the top I have a positive x and a negative 4. So all I really have to do here is factor out a negative 1. And this would become an x minus 4. Remember, once I factor out a negative, it switches the signs of both of these. So the negative x becomes positive x and the positive 4 becomes negative 4. Well, now we'll notice this is the same. And when they're the same, they will just cancel each other out. And one thing to keep in mind, when you cancel something out in your numerator, you must put a 1 in its place. So this is really what you're going to have. So 1 divided by negative 1, and a simplified answer to that would just be negative 1. So really, when you see these and they're similar, remember, your answer is going to be negative 1. Don't get that confused with if you see this. Okay, now these are, remember here they're different. Now these are exactly the same. The order is just different. Okay, so even if I rewrite, all I would have to do is rewrite this, switch the x and the 9 around. And then this is what I get. And then remember, everything cancels out. And when that happens, remember, our answer is 1. Don't just say everything canceled out, so there's nothing. You have to put a value. And I think on these, they give you kind of that option of no solution or something, but all of these should have an answer, so don't choose that as an option. All right, let's look at another one. So again, what you're going to do on these is factor whatever I can factor in my numerator, and then whatever I can factor in my denominator. Looking at that denominator, nothing's really going to be factored. That's going to say m plus n. But what can I factor out from my numerator? Well, I can factor out a negative 6. And that will leave me m plus n. Again, the negative 6 are coming out. Since I'm factoring out a negative, it's going to switch the signs of both of these to positive. And again, these are the same. So even though this wasn't in parentheses, you can put these in parentheses if it makes you feel better. These, the m plus n's would cancel out, and I'm just going to be left with negative 6. So we're just going to do a few more examples of these. X squared plus. Again, reduce your numerator, reduce your denominator, look to see if there's anything the same that will cancel out. And there will be stuff that are going to be the same that are going to cancel out. So here I can factor out a 9. That's going to leave me x plus 5. In my denominator, I can factor out an x. And again, I'm going to have x plus 5. So that's where we know that the x plus 5s at the end are going to cancel out. And I'm going to be left with just 9 over x. X plus 4. The first trinomial we have that needs to be factored. There isn't an a value, so we're just looking for the numbers that will multiply to give me 40, that when I add together give me negative 6. So that would be x minus 10 x plus 4. Sometimes they kind of give you a hint in one of the numerator denominators. When I see this x plus 4, I almost know that's going to be one of the factors of this trinomial here. Okay, so my x plus 4s would cancel out. This is the only, I'm telling you to be careful. We don't just leave it blank and then x minus 10 on the bottom. We have to have a value in that numerator. If the 1 was in the denominator, we didn't have to put it in. But remember, so everything cancels out. We need to put a value there. And that value is going to be 1. All right. We kind of talked about this. When you see 4 terms, and we know we're factoring, that is your hint. And that was just x plus 4. I put the brackets around it. But with this denominator here, when we have 4 terms, that's your hint that you're going to do grouping. So if you want to just kind of do the grouping, do the factoring off to the side, kind of separate this off, and then just go in and fill it in, that's fine too. So in other words, we're doing grouping here. We're going to group the first 2, group the second 2, and factor. What can I pull out? X squared plus xw. You factor out an x, and you're going to be left with x plus w. We look here. We factor out a 4. Again, x plus w. Both have the x plus w, so we take the x plus 4 and then multiply it by the x plus w. So that's the factor of this numerator here. So now we'll replace that numerator with what we factored, x plus 4, x plus w. Remember, the denominator had that x plus 4. So they would cancel out. And this is where I said, you don't have to, when it's in the denominator, we don't have to put a 1 there. It's understood to be there. So our answer is just going to be x plus w. We don't have to write x plus w over 1. If it's in the top part of the fraction, if it's in your numerator, yes, we have to put a 1 there. But if the bottom cancels out, we don't have to put it over 1. I don't think it'll mark you wrong if you did, but it's just good practice. We'll do another one with some grouping. Again, you know you're grouping when you see 4 terms. All right. So I may do these groupings off to the side. Group the first 2, group the second 2. Remember, when that minus sign is there on that second term, that I got to factor out a negative value. So I'm looking at these first 2. I see they both have an x. That's the only thing I can factor out. So that'll leave me 3y plus 5. Now I come over here. There's nothing I can factor out here besides a negative 1. Okay, so I have to factor out a negative value. So when I factor out that negative 1, remember, this is going to make both of these positive. Okay, so remember, you always got to, if there was a negative, if this was a positive, I'd factor out a positive 1 because there'd be nothing to factor out. But since that was negative, between that second and third sign, remember, I always have to factor out a negative value. So this gives me x minus 1, 3y plus 5. That's when I'm going to replace my numerator over here, x minus 1, 3y plus 5. Well, now I still got to do this denominator. And I have 4 terms, so again, I'm doing grouping. Kind of very similar to this here, as all I can factor out is an x, and I'm left with 7y plus 1. I have that minus sign there, and there's nothing I can factor out of these 2. So I'm just going to factor out a negative 1, and that'll give me, turn both of these positive. That becomes 7y plus 1. So this is just x minus 1, 7y plus 1. That's what I'm replacing in my denominator over here. So now we look to see what will cancel out. We'll notice there's x minus 1, those would cancel out. And that's it. That's all I can cancel out. So my answer, 3y plus 5. And you can drop these parentheses when you enter these, or you can keep them on. It doesn't matter. It's not going to mark you wrong if you keep them on, but this would be your answer for that. So again, factor your numerator, factor your denominator, cancel out whatever is the same there. All right, here's another example. In this example, we do have a value here for a. So again, I got to factor this trinomial and then factor this again 4 terms, so I know I'm doing my grouping. So factor my grouping. So let's start with this trinomial over here. Again, there's a value in front of my a. So remember, we start out a times c, so 4 times -2, which would give me -8. Factors of -8, that will add together to give me -7, so it's going to be -8 and a +1. So that is what I'm using to rewrite -7, -8x, plus 1x, and then I move these numbers down, -2 and 4x squared. I'm going to do my grouping here and here. 4, I got that 4 and 8, so I could pull out a 4, and they both have an x. So I'm going to pull out a 4x, and that's going to leave me x minus 2. And if you notice, there's nothing I can factor out here, and there's a positive there. So I will factor out a +1, and I'll be left with x minus 2. If you think back to, let me find that example. It was right here. There was nothing I could factor out here, but that was negative, so I had to factor out a -1. Okay, so that's why here I factor out a -1, because that sign going in from my second to third was negative. Well, in this example, it was positive, so I'm factoring out a +1. So again, I got x minus 2's are the same. I'm going to factor out 4x plus 1. And then times x minus 2. Now that's only our first part. That is my numerator. I'm going to put that up there. Now we got to work on this denominator. There's 4 terms there. I'm just going to have to use more space. 4x to the third plus 2x squared plus 4x plus 1. All right, so we look at our first 2. 4x to the third plus, so I could factor out a 2. 2 will go into both 8 and 2. And I'm going to factor out x squared. One has 3, the other has 2 x's, so I'm going to factor out 2 of those x's. So I'm going to be left with 4x plus 1. And again, you'll see I have the 4x plus 1 already, so all I'm going to factor out there is a 1. And keep it 4x plus 1. 4x plus 1 is the same. I put the 2x squared plus 1 together, and then the 4x plus 1 together. So that was my denominator I just factored. Let me separate this so you know. This is my numerator up here. This is my denominator. So I'm going to rewrite my factored form of my denominator. 2x squared plus 1, 4x plus 1. And if we did it right, you'll notice things are the same. If they're the same, they cancel out. And then our answer is whatever is left. In this case, x minus 2 over 2x squared plus 1. And one more example. This one's a kind of fun one. So we got to make sure that we factor these all the way. All right. So if we start out here with this, we got room down here. I'm going to move that 3x squared minus 27. The first thing we're going to start out is factoring out 3. So we'll have x squared minus 9. Now hopefully you don't stop there, because x squared minus 9 is a factor of 2 squares, okay? That factors to x plus 3, x minus 3. All right? So this is the whole completed form of that denominator, of that numerator. I'm going to rewrite that up here, 3, x plus 3, x minus 3. Now our numerator, I don't have to really do it off to the side. All I can factor out is a 6. And that would leave me x minus 3. So we just got to be careful on this one, okay? So the x minus 3's we know cancel out. And we're going to be left with 3 times x plus 3 over 6. If you enter that answer the way it is, it'll be wrong. The reason being, we have to reduce this 3 over 6. Okay, so 3 over 6 reduces to 1/2, right? And we still have that x plus 3. And just when you're entering the answer, we really don't need that 1 there, because that 1's always going to be there anyways. I think if you enter it like that, it'll mark it right. But you can write it like this, x plus 3 over 2, or you can even drop that parentheses and just write x plus 3 over 2. One thing about this program is it usually would take any one of these 3 answers as a right answer. Okay, so even if you left the 1 there in the parentheses, it would say it was right. If you took that 1 out and left it in parentheses, it would say right, and if you just dropped the parentheses. All right, so that is 7.1, rational functions and simplifying rational expressions.